Fall camp's underway, and Oregon's biggest questions this year are on defense, which is great news.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks, which is why if you have not already, please like, comment, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to or watch the show, which today is brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Is the Ohio State game the biggest ever at Autzen, and the Duck is everywhere? All coming up on today's show. But fall camp is officially underway. The excitement should be building. We are into the month of August, less than a month, or if you think 30 days is a month, until Oregon's first actual, real, honest-to-goodness football game against Idaho. And the biggest questions I have for this Oregon team are on the defensive side of the ball. Why is that great news, Spencer? Well, I still feel great about Oregon's defense. In fact, I think they're going to at least match the production they put up a season ago, which was statistically, if you're looking at a couple of key metrics like points allowed per game, was the best defense Oregon has had since 2019. I think the numbers this defense puts up could be even stronger going into a Big Ten where points are not as abundant. So that's a great place for Oregon to be. Now, it does not mean those questions are not real, that they could not come back to bite Oregon if the questions aren't answered positively going into this season. But number one question when I think about this Oregon team, if I were a guest on somebody else's show and they said, well, what's number one concern? What worries you the most? How are the safeties going to hold up in coverage? Is that as much of a problem in the Big Ten as it is in the Pac-12? No. Because last year you had the best quarterback conference in the country. You had NFL guys scattered all over the place. And this year, it's just not the same. It's not even close to the same. However, you will run into offenses like Ohio State's or Washington's or maybe Wisconsin's a little bit, depending on how Tyler Van Dyke fits into that system up there in Madison, that have the ability to push the ball down the field, that have the ability to challenge your safeties. And that, I think, was Oregon's biggest weakness a year ago. I actually thought Oregon's corners last year were really good in coverage for the most part, and that the safeties, when they got matched up on receivers, that's where Oregon really, really struggled in those games against Washington. And you lose a couple of guys out of that room. You add a couple of new faces. You know, Brandon Johnson appeared recently at the Oregon Media Days for the first time as a Duck because he was a later arrival. And you've got Kobe Savage coming in from Kansas State. You've got Tysheem Johnson back in that room. I just have questions. I have questions. You know, when I talked to Jeffrey Bossa at Big Ten Media Days last week and asked him about Kobe Savage, the first thing he said when I said, you know, what stands out about him, his physicality. Well, I mean, that's great. Guy is a playmaker. He's been an all-conference guy, and certainly you can't be one-dimensional and be an all-conference player. But he didn't jump straight to he's a ball hawk. He didn't jump straight to his coverage skills are amazing, or man, he just locks down wide receivers. It was, no, he's a hard hitter. He flies around the field, and he pops guys, which is great. I'm here for a tone-setting safety any day of the week. But Tysheem Johnson over the top, I don't think was spectacular in coverage a year ago. Brandon Johnson, obviously haven't watched very much, if any of him, because he was at Duke for the last couple of seasons. And the depth of that safety unit as well, I think could really easily get tested. Do you have, you know, an Aaron Flowers as a major contributor, or a Peyton Woodyard who transferred over from Alabama but is a true freshman, or a Tyler Turner who's a redshirt freshman? One of those guys, at the very least, should be a rotational player on this defense, or will be on the two deep. And if a guy goes down with an injury or has to come out for a play, one of those guys has to step up and be able to fill the role admirably. So that's definitely positionally the number one question I have. The number two question that I have that is more of a point of intrigue than concern, but who steps up on this defensive line, particularly on the interior? You lose Brandon Dorlus, Popo Amavai, Casey Rogers, Taki Taimani. Well, that's a lot of guys from last year's team. You bring in Jamari Caldwell and Derek Harmon. Those are your two starters. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Barring an injury, those are your two starting interior guys. But I just listed all four players that were key figures on last year's defense because it's a position where you have to have guys rotate in. Guys wear out, you rotate them in, and Dan Lanning and Tosh Lupoi specifically, I think, like rotating in defensive linemen at a pretty high rate to keep them as fresh as possible, which is why they've recruited this position so hard. And you have a veteran in there like Keon Ware-Hudson, who I think we know at this point is a solid player. He's not overly disruptive or, an all-conference caliber guy, but can you put him in there and he does solid things? Yeah, he absolutely does. But who's the next spot? Who's the fifth defensive tackle that, can see action in a goal line situation, for instance? I don't know. Is it Amari Washington? Can Aiden Breland do it as a true freshman? Could you see Mikhail Gardner, who looked really impressive in the spring game? Those 2023 and 24 recruiting classes are going to show up in some form or fashion. The way that Dan Lanning has talked about this position group, it seems like the 2023 guys are more likely to be there because he's talked about it in the context of development and how, it can take a while to get acclimated to play that sort of position, which makes plenty of sense because that's typically the case on the offensive line and on the defensive line, more so than any other position group for guys coming out, even really highly rated players, like Aiden Breland, Elijah Rushing will probably have a role perhaps on Oregon's defense this year, but more than likely they get in for mop-up time and they're key players on the 2025 defense. But with injuries and you never know. You never know. So that's the next question that I have. But that one is less of a worry because I think the high-end talent is there. I think the depth is there. And I'm really excited to see which of those recruits really start to pop in their first or second year along the defensive line. And then this is the third one. This one goes to the offensive side of the ball. What, if any, is the drop-off along the offensive line? I anticipate there being at least a slight regression. You're going from Jackson Powers Johnson to Poncho. Now, everyone's been raving about Poncho in the early portion of fall camp. I think that's great. The early indicators, playing as a true freshman, I was just talking about how hard that is to do. He did it last year. He was Oregon's sixth offensive lineman. He started the Fiesta Bowl at center. Oregon scored 45 points. So I have high hopes for him. I think his potential is really high. Is he going to be as good as the guy who won the Remington Award for the best center in college football? No, probably not in his first year. You go from Stephen Jones to Matthew Bedford. Is Bedford able to replicate the same sort of production that Jones gave you a year ago? Is Davey Uli as the sixth offensive lineman as good as Poncho was last year? I think these guys are capable, but offensively, that's my biggest question. And I think overall, these are first world problems for Oregon to have in the college football sense because these are pretty specific questions. Overall, I expect Oregon's offensive line to be one of the best in the Big Ten. But the question about how good Bedford will be and how good Poncho is at center, that's not going to determine whether they're competent or whether they're capable or whether the offense can function. That's determining whether they're the number 1, 2, or 3 unit in the Big Ten or a top 10 unit in all of college football. Because you have 2 NFL tackles in Johnny Cornelius and Josh Connerly. You have a veteran starter in Marcus Harper. I got no question marks there, just with the other 2 spots. What questions do you have about Oregon going into this year? Let me know in the YouTube comments or hit me up on X, formerly known as Twitter. So, the Ohio State game is going to be phenomenally great television in every sense of the term. Is it the biggest game at Autzen ever? That's coming up next. Right after we get to Game Time, an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. They've got killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying Major League Baseball tickets. You can save up to 60% buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, whatever you're looking for. You can save even more when you choose a section and let Game Time choose the seats. Just take the guesswork out of buying Major League Baseball tickets with Game Time. All you have to do is download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE, Locked On College, all one word for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Quick little second segment sip, and we are off and rolling. Ohio State's going to be a big game. Spencer, that's plainly obvious. Okay, well, let's dive into it a little bit further. Is this the biggest game ever at Autzen Stadium? Depends on how you define biggest. It really does. The stakes are going to be immense. I don't know if they're going to be the highest they've ever been for any Autzen Stadium game in the history of Oregon football, because there have been a lot of football games. Certainly this one's going to be up there. You're going to have a national audience watching on television. You're going to have more Ohio State fans than Oregon fans are perhaps used to in that stadium. Big Ten fans, specifically Ohio State, historically travel very well. So it could feel different. It will look different because Ohio State will actually be playing in Eugene, which is a crazy concept, but welcome to realignment. So I started thinking about where this game could fit in the history of Oregon football and how big the game is. It's going to be massive. Both teams should be undefeated. You look at the early part of Ohio State's schedule and the early part of Oregon's schedule, they should both be 5-0 going into it. You're going to have two preseason top 10 teams who are 5-0 playing a regular season game, which could be the first of two meetings. Entirely possible. Dare I say likely. But I'm not making that prediction right now, at least not yet. Other games, though, that would rival this Ohio State matchup, presuming that both teams are undefeated going into it, and the winner would then catapult themselves, if they're not already, inside the top 5, maybe even into the top 3 in the rankings nationally. You'd become almost a lock to make the college football playoff, because you could probably even lose 2 games the rest of the season and still find your way into the 12-team format. There will be plenty on the line. Will it be as consequential as perhaps a rematch in the conference championship game? Probably not. But will it be a huge game? Yeah. And it's the first year of Ohio State and Oregon being in the same conference, and I think that's going to add to the interest and intrigue from a national television standpoint, where you're going to have College Game Day heavily considering whether they should be in Eugene. I'll get to more on that in just a sec. But whether they are or not, you're going to have a lot of people watch. I think when Oregon went to Ohio State back in 2021, something like 12 million people watched, which is a big number. The most watched regular season game every year is usually Ohio State-Michigan, which gets like 16 to 18 million per year. Oregon-Ohio State could probably be in that same sort of range. With the way that Oregon has recruited, the way they've put themselves out there from a branding standpoint, the momentum that both these teams have, the expectations they have, it's going to be a massive game. But other games it'll have to go up against, go back to 2014 when Michigan State came to town, also a Big Ten team, not Ohio State, but it was a top 10 team. Similar stakes, but a bigger brand. So you'd probably say, okay, the Ohio State game is going to be bigger than that one, but that Michigan State game was huge. You could think of Oklahoma. That's just, oh man. You can't think of that game. I hope at this point time heals all wounds, and even Oklahoma fans can laugh about that debacle in 2006, the famous image of the referees conferring who's got the ball, the Oklahoma guy holding it up. I got the ball. It's right here, guys. Oregon ball. Yeah. Oklahoma's ranked 15th, and Oregon was 18th in that game back in 2006. So a top 10 matchup? No, not quite. Now, 2010, this was a conference game, as is this one. Stanford came to town, and Stanford was number 9. Oregon was also a top 10 team. That had Brent Musburger and Kirk Herbstreit on the call. The big game crew, as you would call it if you play EA College Football 25, which I do. Quick side note, if any of you want to play me, shoot me a note on Twitter, and we will find a time. That was certainly a big one. From an impact standpoint, the Washington game in 2018 has to be considered here, because that wasn't just a big game because it was Washington and because Washington was ranked number 7, but you look back retroactively and you say, well, it's the game that Kayvon Thibodeau says made him decide, I want to go to Oregon and play college football. That proved to be very impactful, of course. But it's also the game where Oregon football kind of marked itself as, we're back to being Oregon now. The rest of the season didn't go perfectly as planned, but that re-entered Oregon onto the national stage. Nothing about this game with Ohio State is going to re-enter Oregon onto the national stage. They beat Ohio State 3 years ago in the regular season, so it's not as if no one's ever seen Oregon beat the Buckeyes before. And that win was monumental, but it was in Columbus, which is why it's not on this list. Another one that's under the radar that, I've seen in my lifetime, and certainly I'm not the oldest fellow out there. If you remember a game from the early 2000s when I was but a wee lad and couldn't comprehend football yet, or the 90s before I was born, drop it in the YouTube comments or shoot me a message. I'd be very curious to hear what you all think about the biggest games ever at Autzen Stadium. But one that flies under the radar is Washington in 2010. Now, Oregon ended up winning the game comfortably. Washington was unranked. So why would I put that on this list? Because it was the first time that Oregon had ever climbed to number 1 in the Associated Press. That was a really, really big deal. And Oregon, by the way, came out kind of tight in that game. But then eventually they figured it out. So those are the contenders that I could think of in terms of hype going into the game, impact, television audience. This Ohio State game is certainly going to happen. We might not know until after the game whether it's the biggest ever at Autzen, but going into it, I don't remember a game quite as hyped as this one that brings the level of cachet and brand respect that Ohio State has. It's certainly up there. It's certainly up there. Right now, I'd say the biggest game ever at Autzen Stadium was that Washington game in 2018 because of the importance that it carried for the long-term outlook of Oregon football. That was a really, really big deal to beat the eventual Pac-12 champions. So, yeah, if I missed any, by all means, let me know. But this Ohio State game, yeah, it's hard to put it outside the top 3 biggest games all time at Autzen Stadium. On that note, I got this question from Rex. Mailbag, always open. YouTube comments, X, formerly known as Twitter, at @McLaughlin_CFB or at Locked On Ducks. DMs and mentions wide open. If you want priority access and a bunch of other perks, go join the flock over at Subtext. Link in the description below wherever you listen to or watch this show. Free 14-day trial. If you don't like it, no obligation whatsoever. But you do get more than a few perks over there. I make it worth your while. This question came in from Rex. Hey, Spencer, not sure if you saw the article from Yardbarker today titled Dream College Game Day 2024 Locations. They had week 3 listed as the Civil War game for College Game Day location. I'm sorry, but did they look at the rest of our schedule and have blinders on when Ohio State comes to town? Anyway, which leads me to ask if College Game Day comes to town for the Ohio State game. As much as I hate early kickoffs, what are the chances of a 9 a.m. kickoff asking for a friend, okay, it's me, who also has tickets to see Godsmack the same night? LOL. Respect. First of all, Rex, those tickets should be, you should be willing at a moment's notice to sell them if it is an evening kickoff. You can't miss Oregon, Ohio State. Not the first iteration as Big Ten teams. You can't do it. Even if my favorite artist of all time is Billy Joel. I had the privilege of seeing him in concert up in Seattle at the end of May. If I had another opportunity to see him, I would do it. If I had the tickets, but it was the same day as Oregon, Ohio State, nope, sorry, can't do it. Cannot go. But the odds of College Game Day getting there are really good. It is not set in stone. So the college football slate that week is incredibly loaded. I mean, incredibly loaded, because you don't just have the Oregon Ohio State game. You have a lineup that includes Ole Miss at LSU. The SEC is always popular. Florida at Tennessee. That one's not quite as likely. Penn State at USC. Again, I think that would be Oregon Ohio State. I'm just saying there are other contenders here. Kansas State at Colorado, gosh, I would absolutely hope not. Here's the tough one, though. Here's the tough one. Texas and Oklahoma in the Red River Showdown is the same day as Oregon, Ohio State. It is most unfortunate. That is a legitimate contender. Probably the biggest contender to steal College Game Day away from Eugene. I don't know, admittedly, the folks over at Yardbarker, I hadn't heard of them before this, but getting game day, always a great experience in Eugene. It was awesome in 2022 when UCLA came to town and then Oregon was on game day on the road. twice last year at Washington and at Utah. So I think the chances are good, but it is not a lock. It is not a lock when you have Red River. If Oklahoma has a couple losses on the schedule, or at least one loss maybe, I don't know that they will, but if they have a couple losses on the schedule going into that game, that raises the probability of game day coming to Eugene. But as for whether that game's an early kickoff, that'll be up to the Big Ten, because if they look at that game and say it's the biggest game in the Big Ten that week, and I believe it is, the rest of the Big Ten slate: Purdue, Illinois, Washington, Iowa, Minnesota, UCLA, Penn State, USC, Wisconsin, Rutgers. So yeah, like, it's their biggest game. There's no question about that. It's just a matter of, is it going to be the big noon kickoff? Are there any other games that they would want to go for? I would think they go for it. And am I here for a 9 a.m. Pacific time kickoff? Yes. As a consumer, it fits very well with my schedule and my work schedule, my ability to watch it live rather than taping it or watching it while I'm calling a game or something. So, which it doesn't really happen. So yeah, I think that has got a good probability. I'm here for an early kickoff. It's going to be a big game. Cannot wait. Love the question. I have more to get to in the mailbag department, but before we do that, we're going to talk about the Duck. It's the greatest mascot. There's just nobody better. That's coming up next. First, we're getting to eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts, that's a lot, for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. So there is an ongoing campaign by the Oregon marketing department to just send the Duck places. This was not a joke. If you saw it on Twitter, we're like, oh, that can't be real. No, the Duck was legitimately at Nebraska's media day. Not at Big Ten media days, but just like Dan Lanning spoke to the media after Oregon's practice recently for the first time, the Duck was just there in the room with a microphone. Oregon doesn't even play Nebraska this year. They don't even play. Then there was a picture they tweeted out of the Duck hanging on the gate at Minnesota's field, wanting to get in. Like, it's so great. It's so great. Number one, it's fantastic offseason content. Number two, it's just in line with everything Oregon has been doing over the last month or so. The giant duck in Indianapolis, the uniform rollouts, everything is just to get on people's radars, to just remind teams in the Big Ten that we're here and we're not going anywhere and you're going to have to deal with us all the time. And as it pertains to that giant inflatable duck, I am really sad that I missed it in Indianapolis and couldn't get a picture, but I hope they bring it to every single road game. I legitimately do. Could that present logistical issues? Could you get a crazy fan that throws lawn darts at it and pokes a hole? Yeah, you could have that happen. But if they can work those things out, I'm on board with it. I'm on board. I love it. I think it's just completely and utterly fantastic. So the way that Oregon is just going about going into the Big Ten, nobody else is doing this. The Trojan mascot is not at somebody else's media day or jokingly trying to get into stadium and taking pictures with the new mascots and whatnot. They're not doing any of that sort of stuff. And it's very on brand for Oregon, and I think sends a very clear message to the rest of the Big Ten of this is what you should expect. This is what Oregon does. They get in your face, and if you don't like it, that's too bad. They're going to do it anyway. So I wanted to shout out the Duck. That's not the only shout out on today's show. Whilst I was in Indianapolis last week, I got a restaurant recommendation from Garrett, and there was one other of you that sent me a restaurant recommendation as well, which, on a personal note, from me to all of you, is utterly fantastic. That you saw that I was in the city where you reside, and you're like, dude, you got to check out here. Okay. Went to Bodhi, Bodhi, Thai restaurant. Let me tell you, I love Thai food. I love Thai. The best meal I've ever had is a Thai restaurant in Las Vegas. This was not that, but holy smokes was it good. I mean, first of all, incredibly reasonably priced. Second of all, they had great drinks. Third of all, the food was awesome. Great environment too, kind of like a very packed in, sound bouncing off. It was popping on, what day of the week was that? Thursday? Yeah, it was popping on a Thursday night. That was a 10 out of 10 restaurant recommendation. I mean, it was outstanding. I had the yellow curry and some garlic naan, and chef's kiss. I'm a huge foodie. Everydayers who have been with me for a long time, I appreciate you. They know that very well, but that was some good stuff. I would not have shouted it out and you, Garrett, on the show if that had not been good. That was fantastic. So if any of you were ever in Indianapolis, go check it out. That was a great ending to my trip. I went to dinner there with Scopel and we had a great time, and he had the same review. Like, this is awesome. Like it was great. Really, really great. More mailbag questions here. This one from Bud. What important quality is extremely vital for a college football coach now that wasn't important 10 years ago? Adaptability has always mattered at some level. I think the importance of it has just grown exponentially. Great case study for this is going to be Dabo Swinney at Clemson, who doesn't like playing the NIL and transfer portal games. Well, a lot of people, would look at him and say, you're holding your program back if you don't do that. Well, thankfully, Oregon doesn't have that problem because Dan Lanning is willing to partake in those things and maximize whatever resources Oregon does have, which are not unlimited NIL, by the way, and go out and build the best roster that you possibly can. Does Clemson still have a good roster? Are they going to be a good team this year? Yeah, they are. They recruited at a high level, and recruiting is the lifeblood of your program. That just happens to now include bringing in kids via the portal. So Clemson still has an above average, if you go down the lineup of teams in the ACC, they have a top 4 roster. They easily have a top 4 roster, but they could have the number 1 roster. They could be closer to what Florida State has got. They could go get key players like the Seminoles did a year ago, like Keon Coleman and Johnny Wilson, but Clemson's not doing that. They could still have a lot of really talented players, but they cap what their roster can be by not adapting. And I think that a lot of the coaches that get forced out or retire at major programs are more old school and don't want to be in the NIL portal world. So I think the adaptation to whatever the new landscape is, or embracing realignment, or marketing tactics like putting the duck in the water or putting the duck in the Nebraska press conference, like all of that sort of stuff helps your program. It contributes and it helps create an identity. And I think Lanning does a great job of leaning into all that sort of stuff as the head coach. And by the way, speaking of the NIL part of it, I was listening to Josh Pate's show the other day, and he talked about the NIL situation as it pertains to recruiting. And he repeated what I have said and what Brian Smith, our Locked On Recruiting Insider, has said many times on this show and others, that NIL is a factor, but rarely is it the sole factor. I mean, there are very few instances. You can find a handful of kids where they're just trying to get the most amount of money possible. That is less than 10% of recruits. That might be even less than 5%. I don't have a specific number, but Pate said what I have believed and what Brian has said for a long time, which is that NIL is a factor, but it is not the factor. You still have to make a pitch. And he was praiseworthy of programs like Texas with Steve Sarkisian, or Oregon with Dan Lanning, and their ability to not just offer NIL, but to offer a wholesale pitch and understand how NIL fits into that pitch. So yeah, I think that all is really important. Couple quick ones here to end today's show. This one from C.Smooth. Hey, Spencer, got another question for your show. If you watch Pat McAfee's interview with Dan Lanning, Pat asked Lanning about his hard commits, and Lanning said he couldn't discuss that. Any idea why? Keep up the good work. Yeah, this is just kind of par for the course for Dan Lanning. Hard commits, I presume, being verbal commits or players in the high school class that are coming to Oregon. I don't think there's another term or another area where hard commits is used, but if there is, let me know. Lanning doesn't put out anything or say anything that he doesn't feel is simultaneously doing his job and his media obligations and going to help the program. Those are the only things. He's not going to give you content just to give you content. He's not going to give you a soundbite just to give you a soundbite. Except in the Colorado game last year, which, that was obviously intentional. Guess what? It worked very well, 42-6. So I think that he just isn't someone that divulges a ton. And I'm not certain on this, but he also might have restrictions with regards to talking about kids before they actually sign with Oregon or show up. Like, there can be weird NCAA rules, so I think he's just playing it safe and conservative, and I don't think there's really a lot to that. There are a lot of coaches that operate that way, and Lanning is one of them. This question from James to end today's show. With the NCAA increasing scholarship numbers by 20 to 105, do you think we'll see the end of walk-ons, or are we soon going to be looking at player rosters of almost 120 players? What I would like to see happen is the walk-ons just get scholarships. I think that's a win for everybody around. You could see Oregon go after a bigger roster, but I mean, how many more guys who can reasonably start, number one, are out there, number two, are going to be willing to come to Oregon, right? If you look at the wide receiver room, for instance, now and in the future, what are you going to do with 2 or 3 more guys that could start for you? Like, that just feels like they're bound to transfer out. I'm not saying it's inherently a bad thing. It's just, it strikes me as odd that you would suddenly say, you have 20 more players and Oregon, feels like a weight has been lifted and finally they can go and sign all these kids out of the portal in high school that they weren't getting before. I think that'll be the biggest thing is the walk-ons will get more, will have a higher scholarship rate than they did before. And maybe you see a few players added, but I'd be shocked if the walk-ons remain and then you're bringing in 20 new scholarship caliber players to your roster. Like, walk-ons play an important role. They're practice players. They're glue guys. They're not, they're not trying to have a playing time necessarily. Like, they serve a role on Oregon's team and every team across the country. Maybe they just won't have to, pay for their school now, which I would 100% be down for. I think most people would as well. That's my gut instinct. It's been wrong before, but not often. I'm kidding. Almost never. Appreciate everyone listening. I'll see you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.